Welcome to Radicalize Me. First, I want to thank all the new subscribers. We got a good handful after the Hank Green video, so I really appreciate that. Hope you stick around and like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. And here we go. Today, I want to talk about a book I read recently. It's called Responding to the Right, Brief Replies to 25 Conservative Arguments by Nathan J. Robinson. Nathan J. Robinson, if you're not familiar, is the founder and editor-in-chief of the left-leaning magazine Current Affairs. He identifies as a socialist, although he's often not considered as radical as, say, Marxist-Leninists. And he and I do disagree on some things, but I do think we're mostly on the same side, and it's important to read a variety of ideas, especially within socialism and leftist thought. I did a video on Mao Zedong a while back too, and I don't consider myself a Maoist, so I'm taking Nate Robinson seriously too. Part 1. How conservative arguments work and why they seem more powerful than they really are. Tips for arguing. Familiarize yourself with the other side's case. Here in part 1 of the book, he tells us something familiar, which is to get out of our echo chambers, if you will. But he wants us to do it with a specific goal in mind, which is to not only understand the opposition's arguments, but to determine the strongest possible version of their arguments. This is not only to learn how to counter their arguments, but to understand your own better. The deeper you investigate the world around you, the clearer and more precise you are in your own ideology, which we actually learned from Mao. This is in contrast to how misguided centrist pundits tell you to get out of your echo chamber as some kind of thought experiment, or because you might realize the other side is right about some things. And then you'll put together a mishmash of political stances that take the best of both sides. This is ridiculous because leftists, the ones who do the work, know what conservatives are saying. We know what liberals are saying. For one thing, many of us come from one of those ideologies. There are very few Americans born to firmly socialist parents, but we're also in a position of critique in this society. We're dedicated to ideas which do not fit with the current status quo, which is capitalism, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So we have to know what our rulers, their lackeys in the media, and their followers among the proletariat are saying in order for us to effectively describe it and propose alternatives. So when Robinson says here that he was surprised when he read Dinesh D'Souza's book and found that he doesn't deny America's historical crimes and that it was almost like reading a leftist at times, he's not saying it to give credit to D'Souza. Under no circumstances do you gotta hand it to D'Souza. He points out that D'Souza did not write what he did to critique America. He did it to draw the conclusion that it was actually liberals throughout history who enacted and enabled these horrors. If Robinson was a grifter, he might have said the same things about D'Souza, but then said, I gave his argument a chance and he has some good reasons to blame liberals. This is why I left the left, etc. But no, Robinson is genuine in his politics, and he takes the opportunity to point out the grift of right-wingers like D'Souza and explain the need to take his arguments seriously enough to debunk them effectively. Another thing he points out in this early section is that stories matter as much as empirical correctness. Conservatives, like many people to be honest, often, intentionally or not, misinterpret, misapply, and cherry-pick statistics, and it's important to counter this with proper study. But stories are just as important as to why people hold the beliefs they do. Part 2. Brief replies to 25 conservative arguments. The Nazis were socialists. One important example of his point about stories comes from the 11th argument. The Nazis were socialists. You need an alternate framework for understanding reality. This is one reason why Marxism was extremely successful during the 20th century. It gave oppressed people a clear explanation of why they were oppressed. I do not believe Marxism was correct. Okay, that's enough out of you. It's fine, we'll let it slide. Robinson provides his alternate framework later as he goes through the right-wing positions. But I wish he gave an example here to contrast with Marxism. I've not been able to piece together exactly how non-Marxist socialists differ from those of us who identify as Marxists. Do they have a gripe with dialectical materialism? Do they just not like how 20th century Marxist countries turned out? Too much theory? I don't know, and I don't want to make assumptions, but I believe Marxism is still a great framework, and I don't think we make it any easier to get people on board with socialism by taking Marxism out of the equation. I'll jump ahead here to get a little deeper into the text and explore this Marxism question more. In the Nazis Were Socialists chapter, Robinson briefly explains his interpretation of socialism to contrast with the Nazis. A classless society. Socialists believe that there shouldn't be a small caste of people who own and control everything, and a large majority of people who must sell their labor to the powerful. Anti-racism and women's liberation. Socialists believe that workers of the world must unite and see ethnocentrism as a way of dividing people so that they do not recognize what they have in common. And because socialists deplore hierarchy and exploitation, the domination of women by men has historically been an important socialist concern. Anti-militarism. Socialists have historically deplored war and conquest in which working people are forced to murder their counterparts in other countries. From Eugene Debs's imprisonment for opposing World War I, to the Vietnam protest movement, to the Iraq War, socialists have been the ones saying no to aggressive and futile wars and envisioning a world of peace. He definitely gives a good overview here, which quickly demonstrates that socialists have nothing in common with Nazis, which is why the Nazis killed all the socialists, communists, and trade unionists. The right tends to leave that part out. And if someone asked me what socialism is, I wouldn't hesitate to point them to this page. But in the spirit of understanding people's arguments, what differs here from standard Marxism? The classless society is Marxist. Classless societies have very likely already existed in humanity's past, and the idea of returning to that structure probably predates Marx, but the term is largely associated with Marxism. Anti-racism and women's liberation are certainly part of Marxism, and even more so Marxism-Leninism, and later followers of this ideology like Castro, Che, Sankara, and the Black Panther Party. Workers of the World Unite is directly from Marx and Engels. He does say here that socialists hate hierarchy, which is an interesting one. In theory, yeah, a classless society would likely also be leaderless. But if we look back to 20th century Marxist nations, they definitely had leaders and hierarchy. His hierarchy point strikes me as anarchist because they believe that even a supposedly transitional socialist state is intolerable because it's still a state, and they prefer a more direct shift from capitalism with nation states to communism without nation states. But I don't think Robinson is an anarchist, so I would probably have to ask him directly to fully understand his idea of socialism. Otherwise, I'm hard-pressed to find many differences in what he and I actually want society to look like. So let's move on. Argument 21 is, we must respect the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. Side note, it's really funny how he uses the conservative talking points as the chapter titles, because it looks like you're reading a very different book. My wife knew I was reading this, but a couple of times she walked by and saw the title and said, for a second, I thought we had to have a serious talk. The Constitution and Founding Fathers argument is a good one to take on, because I think it's at the heart of modern conservative thought. There have always been constitutional conservatives, but I think originalism is fairly recent, and it's even more recently that it became the stated ideology of the Republican Party. And it's insane because both parties used to add new amendments. They've done it 17 times since the Bill of Rights. And many countries periodically change their constitutions, either in small ways or complete overhauls. But sometime in the last 30 years, our country, and the Republican Party especially, decided it was absurd to ever change the Constitution or interpret it any other way besides what we think the founders meant. Also, it must be said that even though figuring out what the founders meant may be a positive exercise in understanding our past, but as socialists, as the working class, we have no fealty to bourgeois philosophers from 250 years ago. The working class needs no permission from dead slave owners to wage proletarian revolution. And more generally, we don't need their permission to improve society at all. Of course, it's easy to say, fuck the founding fathers, they were slave owners, it was a long time ago, yada, yada, yada. But Robinson goes a little deeper here, into the ways in which men like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were openly hostile to suggestions of the humanity of black people, American Indians, women, etc. Conservatives like to throw around the argument of, well, it was the time, and fine, I can accept that. We'll put aside that slavery abolitionists and proto-feminists of the time were also of the time. But yes, slavery, active indigenous genocide, and traditional gender roles were the law of the land back then. The problem comes when you want to take the ideas of these guys who were of the time, that is, the late 1700s, as gospel, and make it the law of the land today. That's a ridiculous idea that can't even be applied evenly, but that's not important to reactionary white supremacists who just see rhetorical games like constitutional originalism as a tool of domination. With all of that said, what Robinson does in the book is point out times when the founding fathers, specifically Jefferson and Adams, had ideas of anti-racism and early feminism presented to them and flatly rejected those ideas. Again, anti-racism didn't come out of nowhere in 1860. Feminism didn't come out of nowhere in 1920. These ideas existed, at least in their nascent forms, and people like Jefferson and Adams were fucking racist and sexist. So I'll share possibly my favorite part of the book here, and the best way to do it is I'll just read about a page and a half. Whether the founding fathers were racist and hypocritical is not a matter of dispute. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, had a low opinion of black intelligence, saying that blacks, quote, are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind, and that, quote, never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. Jefferson did not even consider the possibility that because painting and sculpture require access to equipment and training, the people he kept in chains at Monticello were unlikely to spontaneously indulge in it. It is tempting to rationalize such sentiments as being of a different era. But there were contemporary thinkers calling out Jefferson's racism. Benjamin Banneker, a formerly enslaved black man who became a land surveyor and astronomer, wrote a letter to Jefferson begging him to, quote, readily embrace every opportunity to eradicate that train of absurd and false ideas and opinions which so generally prevails with respect to us, end quote, and castigated him for writing movingly of liberty while simultaneously, quote, detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, end quote. Jefferson gave a brief, polite reply that did not give any indication he understood or cared about Banneker's point. Abigail Adams had no more luck when she tried to educate John Adams about his sexism. In a 1776 letter, she made a simple and polite request. Quote, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She said that patriarchy was an obvious problem. Quote, that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, and pointed out that intelligent people rejected it. Quote, men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. End quote. She suggested that her husband remember the golden rule to treat women as he would wish to be treated, and that men, quote, give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend, end quote. Just a little more here. John Adams was unmoved by his wife's plea on behalf of her sex. Quote, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh, end quote, he said. Quote, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Adams told his wife that male superiority does not exist in practice, suggesting that it was actually women who treated men as their subjects, and that if men abandoned their claim to be in charge, they would soon be subject to, quote, the despotism of the petticoat. History does not record Abigail Adams's sigh as she read this reply, but we can surmise that it was long and deep. Good writing by Robinson there. The dude sounds like a 4chan post. This part honestly blew my mind. I don't know how well known these Jefferson and Adams letters are, but good on Robinson for finding and including them. Again, Jefferson sounds like the least racist guy on Reddit. And Adams makes this stupid argument that is made of all oppressed peoples, which is that if their oppression were to end or even be reduced, they would soon reverse the oppression against white males. The interesting thing about that is it has never happened. Not with women, not with black people in America, not with black people in South Africa, not with formerly enslaved people in Europe, not ever. And it wouldn't happen with the fucking Palestinians either. Thoughts? The book is well cited, with Robinson including a list of further reading at the end of each chapter, plus putting all the footnotes in their own section at the back of the book, which makes them easier to go through if you want to. And most importantly, it's a fun, easy book to read. I do enjoy reading Marx and Engels, but as the ADHD king of the Northeast, I know that text that old can be dense as hell and hard to plow through. So it's good to have modern writers like Robinson and Richard Wolff who make it easier to get acquainted with these ideas. They might best serve as introductions to socialism, and from there you can branch out, but I do recommend this book for anyone who's learning about socialism at any level and frequently encounters these conservative arguments. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do here, please like, comment, and subscribe, and help us out on Patreon if you can. Bye now.